Welcome to Peopleverse. I'm your host, Evan Troxel, and I'm an architect. Peopleverse is a show where I talk with people throughout the building industry to unearth authentic stories from interesting people to entertain and inspire. You might have heard of the metaverse. Well, we're doing something different here. In many ways, the building industry is still very much like the Wild West, even in a time when technology and data are abundant. Peopleverse explores the people and the stories behind the projects to remind us why we got into this industry in the first place and to build relationships along the way. This show is brought to you by Tect, and you can learn more about what we're doing to connect the supply and demand sides of the building industry at tect.com. And you can learn more about Peopleverse at peopleverse.fm. Today, my guest is Bill Dawson. Bill is Executive Director of Concrete Products Group, LLC, a national U.S. network of concrete masonry producers. Bill has 30 years of experience in the construction materials industry, starting with Keystone Retaining Wall Systems, where he served in several roles, including the president. For the last 12 years, Bill has been with Concrete Products Group, where he helps a group of regional block producers promote concrete masonry products to local and national clients. Bill enjoys frequent opportunities to work with both architects and engineers in this role and has become reasonably proficient with AutoCAD, Sketchup, and Revit to develop design resources. Watch out, that's a deadly combination right there. Early in his career, prior to coming to his senses, Bill spent 6 years as a trial attorney, or litigator, which the movie Clueless correctly describes as, quote, the most scary type of attorney. Bill has designed construction products that resulted in 20 U.S. patents. He has 3 degrees, including a BA from Carleton College, a JD from Stanford Law School, and an MBA from the University of Minnesota. Having raised 2 outstanding daughters, Bill and his wife Monica reside in Hamel, Minnesota, with a very well-adjusted golden retriever. So, Bill Dawson, welcome to the podcast. It's fantastic to have you here.
Gotta mention the golden retriever. It's a key piece of happiness.
I love that you ended with that. That's great. Well, welcome to the show. It's great to see you and to meet you. And I wanted to ask you kind of a kickoff question here, which is, do you have a story from your childhood that, when you look back, predicted what you would be doing for a living today?
Well, you know, like most kids, you could probably pick out a lot of different things that would justify a lot of different paths in life. For me, the thing that occurs to me is that when I was a little kid, like from age 4 through elementary school, I had a real passion for playing in the dirt in my backyard. And, you know, I'd do this with friends when they'd come over or on my own. I had a bunch of toys that were construction equipment. I had a scraper, a loader, a dump truck to be sure. I think I had a ready mix truck as well. And I would be back there on a pile of dirt. In those days, you know, your mom would turn you loose at the beginning of the day. Yeah, I'm old, and you would come home at night for dinner. Usually I'd come home for lunch too because I was hungry all the time when I was a kid. But that was kind of the origins. And so, you know, I got off to a start as an attorney. I admire people who are able to take that path. It's a difficult path to be an attorney. Ultimately, it wasn't for me. It was one of those things where you can be good at it and not enjoy it. And so I did a bunch of trials and all that sort of thing. And one day a client of mine approached me and said, hey, we'd like to hire you. And they were, at that time, I think there were 3 or 4 people working there. It was Keystone Retaining Wall Systems, and they were licensing some patented retaining wall products to block producers around the United States. And initially I was like, well, this seems like kind of a weird jump to go from this large law firm to working with these guys, but I liked them. And so I decided to take a chance on it and ended up being there 16 years.
Wow. That's crazy. Totally unexpected.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you before we go to the next step. I want to get back to this early childhood thing because it totally parallels what I experienced as well. And I think I'm sure a lot of people who are of our pedigree, our experience, have also experienced. Like on the architect side, it's a lot of Legos. You hear Legos all the time.
Legos were big with me too. Tonka toys were another one.
Tonka, yep, exactly. I told my origin story on another podcast one time, but it was very similar to yours. Sitting out in the dirt, and I would build little Flintstone houses because there was a bunch of like slate kind of rock in the front yard at our house in Tahoe. And I was just always out there covered in dirt and building little houses. Yep. And I didn't know that I was going to be an architect back then. I was like 6 years old, right? But that was I just wanted to. This is a cool little moment because normally it's Legos, and when I hear someone grew up playing in the dirt with their Tonkas and their tractors and like that just pulls at my my nostalgia as well. So okay, well, continue.
Well, just a little side note. I was at home a few years ago and opened a box, and there were some of these toys. And so I immediately put them in my pocket, and they're sitting on my shelf back there as we speak.
That's great. That is so cool. I bet that brought back so many memories.
Absolutely. And they were, the paint was scraped off of, they were hard used.
Yeah, patina. The patina is that's, I was just telling a guy the other day, like my favorite tools to use in my garage are the ones that are old and beat up, and they just feel good in your hand, right? Like there's something about them that is better than, even though I'm pretty meticulous about taking care of new things, I've inherited a lot of cool tools that I love to use. Like I have these 2 old Estwing hammers that I just love the way they feel in my hand, and there's nothing like it. A new tool does not feel like an old tool.
Yeah, they're old friends.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so continue on after Keystone Retaining Wall Systems.
Well, lots of career twists and turns, companies being bought and sold, multiple things that happen to people. About 12 years ago, some friends of mine who were in the block industry approached me about running Concrete Products Group. These are folks that I'd worked with at Keystone. And I really hadn't had much exposure other than we used the same production equipment to make the retaining walls as the block, but didn't really have a big base of information relating to concrete masonry. But I really like these people. And, it's really the relationships that caused me to look at the new opportunity, and been doing it for 12 years. Some of the folks that I started with in those relationships have now retired. Or sold their companies, or transitions that occur. That's something you don't realize when you're young, is just how the continual coming and going of folks that are part of your professional life, just a natural process. But anyway, formed some really good relationships with the people here, and I have to say I didn't get into this business because of a particular passion for concrete masonry, although that has been something that, as I've learned more about it, is growing, because I really think it's totally underappreciated construction material. But it was relationships with these folks that got me going on it, and kind of to this day keep me at it. Is I really care deeply about what happens to these companies that I work with.
Interesting. It's what you just said there about it being a totally unappreciated construction material. I want to come back to that because I think that there are probably a lot of insights that you have as to why you say that, but just things that we can bring to the surface during this conversation that would potentially be completely unexpected by the design professional side of the audience.
We have an AIA presentation that explicitly is titled 5 Unexpected Benefits of Working with Concrete Masonry, for that very reason, because it's honestly, if it were a new material that we're being brought to the table under a cloak of innovation, people would be blown away by it,
right.
Because it would be, you'd say it does this and that, and amazing. But right. Because it's an old mainstay, not glamorous, let's not kid ourselves, but it really just has so many wonderful attributes for designers and owners and everybody along the way.
Yeah, I think concrete block a lot of times doesn't feel like an inspiring building material in many cases because it gets covered up. And obviously there are uninspiring blocks out there, but I also know that there's a lot of block work. I'm within throwing distance of Palm Springs,
Sure.
and there's some amazing examples of breeze block and block used in really interesting ways in the construction and process that you see on display in both residential and commercial stuff. It's really cool.
Well, on every level. On the aesthetic side, the things you mentioned, it's interesting. There's been a huge uptick in interest in breeze block. And we have a couple of manufacturers, Orco Block and A1 Block. One is in Southern California, one's in Florida, who probably have the most outstanding collection of breeze block that you could hope for. And a lot of times we'll get requests for unusual shapes. And quite often, those two would have those blocks because there's always been popularity in those markets for that product, and it's really growing around the country too.
I definitely want to get back to Concrete Products Group and what you guys are doing as far as, I kind of said it in the intro, but you represent various regions of concrete block manufacturers. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do at TECT is marry up or match people who are looking to do projects in specific places with manufacturers who produce things in those places, right? And that is a big deal, I would assume, for block, because obviously it's transportable, but it's transportable to an extent. It's not the kind of thing that you would want to ship across the country, for instance. And one thing that I've been made aware of throughout, my time here at TECT is if you're looking to do a project in a particular place, the mix will be different there. The types of rocks that they're pulling from will be different there. And those are the kinds of things that as a designer, I would want to know about, right? But I don't necessarily know the right questions to ask. And so that to me is a fascinating thing that happens behind the scenes. It's not really at the surface when it comes to the type of information that design professionals even know they should be thinking about.
Well, that's a very good question because you're right. It is a local product. That's a challenge, but it's also a blessing, both from an environmental standpoint and from a standpoint of if you're an architect who's concerned about helping the communities that you're in. It's a local product. It's going to be put in by a local craftsman, a concrete mason. Contractor who's going to typically be right from the community where the structure's being built. But on the challenge of consistency, that's something that our group has really had to come to grips with, because a lot of what we promote to architects is the ability to get what you want no matter where you go in the country, and to get consistency on the colors. And behind the scenes for the producers, because they're working with different raw materials, that means they have to do some work to make sure that both the color and the texture, because that can vary as well, are consistent. And I think, it hasn't always been an easy process. I think we've gotten to a point where we've learned some lessons where we can deliver that. And that's a big part of our value proposition when we talk to architects, is that you can get this local product that's made right where you want it to be and not have to ship it across the country. And it will be consistent. It will look like what you want it to look like, because you had very specific concepts in mind when you're designing the structure. And so we're able to help you fulfill that vision when you get the finished product up.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. I wonder how much of this just comes out of like basic consumer-based stuff, where it's like McDonald's or Starbucks. Like you expect to get the thing, the exact thing, no matter where you go. That level of consistency is starting to become just something that everybody expects all over the place.
Well, absolutely. And for a multiple location store, we're lucky enough to do a lot of work with the Aldi chain of grocery stores. Mm-hmm. And for them, it's fundamentally important that their stores look the way they do a wonderful job of working with their architecture team to come up with great designs for these stores that represent their brand in a positive way. And so for us, we're just here to help facilitate that type of thing.
So how do you do that? How do you facilitate that kind of thing? Because I imagine, like an Aldi example, it is happening all over the country, right? So
Yep.
this really starts to speak with the coordination that you have to do behind the scenes as an association level for all of these different block manufacturers to, I don't know, share recipes, whatever those
It
things
really
are.
is.
So,
You're on the right track.
okay.
They call them mixed designs, but essentially it's a recipe for block. And so there's a lot of work that's put into it up front. And then, of course, through the specification and fulfillment process, you're checking to make sure there's submittals that are done as the job is getting ready to go. But there is a lot of work up front to work with, the block manufacturers work with color companies, and they have very sophisticated ways of adjusting colors to match based on different raw materials being used. It's a common issue for the industry, but still, it takes discipline and just basically quality control procedures and caring that it's done.
Yeah, again, like these are all things that are just kind of under the surface of what a design professional would even think about having to think about. And it's kind of nice that we don't have to. But I think that also puts a veil between the supply and demand side when it comes to this stuff because, like you said, you have this AIA talk that you do that's talking about the 5 innovative things. And then there's also, I'm sure, like you could probably talk all day about unexpected ways that you could use block or unexpected shapes that you could get block in or thermal qualities or like it seems to me like there's all kinds of stuff that is you guys are kind of a wealth of knowledge. Are you the kind of group that the design professional side should be interfacing with, or are you more behind the scenes coordinating and wanting the design professionals to go straight to the source?
We spend a great deal of time reaching out to the design community to engage them and to help educate them. Unfortunately, the knowledge base in the design community when it comes to designing with concrete masonry isn't what it used to be. And it's a sad thing because it's really a product of the impacts of the recession back in 2008. Unfortunately, I remember it clearly, going into firms before and after. And before, there would be a real mix of ages in the firms that we would call on and all levels of experience and people who are you could find somebody in that firm who knew concrete masonry. Afterwards, there would be 1 or 2 gray-haired folks in the room, and everyone else is in their 20s. And kudos to the young people, but unfortunately, that's a cultural thing where so much knowledge went out the door during those hard times. And so that's a challenge for the industry as a whole to make sure that we can equip people who are working with construction materials now to understand the materials and be able to make the best use of them.
Did that same thing happen on the supply side as well with people leaving the industry with that knowledge? They just kind of walked right out the door with it, or is it more consistent?
I'd say our industry, just based on our nature, probably one of our challenges is that we've got a lot of folks who are aging out of the workforce, and their knowledge is going with them. It's a challenge, I think, across the board right now for both producer, really any sector of the economy. We don't have the youngest workforce, and we really need to address that as an industry to get more young people engaged and excited about it.
This just came out of nowhere, but I was in Las Vegas for the National AIA conference a few years ago, and I was lucky enough, because I do another podcast, to get invited to go visit the contractors union, which is a huge training facility that they have out there. And they teach all kinds of really high-tech stuff. I mean, like, I saw amazing machines for cutting drywall, and they could wrap any corner, inside, outside corners, all out of one sheet because they had this custom cutter. They had an underwater welding setup. They had gantry cranes, and it was incredible. I would think that a facility like that is a huge attraction for people to get into the construction industry. How are you guys bridging that gap to address the issue that you just brought up?
Well, I think it's just basic challenge of workforce development. And, a real constraint on most trades right now is availability of workers, whether it's masons or carpenters or you name it. Our industry is doing some really positive things to start develop high school training classes for folks who would be suited to become masons. And, it's really a pretty awesome path for a younger person who might want to be outside, who might, have an interest in building things. Someone actually of my younger self's mindset, where you just like being outside and playing in the dirt. But it's a great career path. They will be every bit as well equipped to earn a great living as folks who go to college.
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue, a stigma that we have in society, is that a desk job going through university to achieve a desk job is like the one acceptable path.
Yeah.
And that is really hurting the kind of jobs that you're talking about.
Well, we need workers. We need people who can build things. Yeah, it's just fundamental to society.
Yeah, architecture is built by hand, right, by contractors for people. And I think like that whole human people element is something that not enough people have at the forefront of their mind. They're thinking of these things as I don't know. I see a lot of stuff about robotics, right? I've seen the robotic bricklaying machines and things like that, and I think that people are attracted to those nice new shiny things, but the logistics around those machines is still incredibly difficult, and it's not good for everything, right? And I can't imagine just replacing a whole workforce with those. It's going to take a long time for that to happen. But at the same time, you don't have people signing up to become masons, it seems like. So that is a conundrum.
Indeed. Probably one we won't be able to solve this morning, but
No.
but it's something that on the one hand you can see the weakness, but on the other hand the opportunity is so great for people. People are looking for jobs that are meaningful and that they can come home and be proud of what they did during the day, and that's exactly what these types of jobs are.
Well, I would love to kind of shift the conversation into bridging the gap between the supply and demand side with your perspective here. So I'll offer up a little kickoff to this question, but what do architects and design professionals get wrong about your product? And I'll just, like I said, I'll throw something out there, which is concrete block equals 8x8x16 gray block, right? It's a 2-unit. That I think that's what everybody pictures in their mind when they think about CMU, and I know that that's not the whole story. So I'll just kick it off there, and you take it.
Okay, well, you just pulled the string on the talkie doll, unfortunately. Okay. The first thing that I think architects don't understand very well is how much do different materials cost to use, and not just cost to buy a block, for example, but to build a wall. What are our options cost-wise for building a wall? And typically people would not expect block to be the low-cost alternative, but in most cases it will be. If you're competing with a metal frame structure or wood frame structure, the thing you have to bear in mind is that's just the frame. You have to have layers for that wall system to work as an assembly. It has to have fire protection and weather protection and temperature control. There are block systems where just by laying the block, you'll have all of that done in one step. And as a result, it's very cost effective. So that's one thing. The other thing I think would be not understanding the full array of aesthetic options that are available with block. Because there is a tendency to say, okay, it's gray, it's 8 inches by 16 inches, it's flat. Shameless plug, if you go to our Concrete Products Group website, the first thing you'll see is a block that has both angular and curvilinear surfaces to it. doesn't look like anything that you've seen or would expect to see from a block. It's a product line we call Aubrey. It's a masonry veneer that's intended specifically to give designers unlimited choices, because basically you can take this modular unit, you can combine these 5 different shapes, you can combine, or you can change the orientation, whether it's vertical or horizontal, bond pattern. By the time you're done with that, you've got, what's a permutation of 5? Well, not 5. It's orientations, bond patterns. By the time you're done with that, you've got maybe a permutation of 13, which is a lot of different patterns. And of course, you can introduce randomness as well. So aesthetically, the idea that a block is a block is a block just doesn't hold up very well once you understand the material better. And that's not to mention all of the different surface textures you can put on block. Some of the blocks that are being sold today are polished. It's done using technology that came over from the stone industry. And so you can get a block that's so shiny, smooth, that it's reflective. You can see reflection in it.
Is that referred to as honed, or is that something different? Is this even a higher level of polish?
There aren't really standardized terms for these.
Okay.
The older version of this would be a ground block, a ground face burnished, you might have heard.
Yep.
The later iterations of this use polishing equipment where we'll have like 12 stations where it goes finer, 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 until the result is something that's just outstandingly beautiful. You'd think it was marble or a very expensive custom stone. And so I don't think a lot of designers, when you say the word block or CMU2, that would not be the image that would immediately flow to mind. But but there are really unlimited aesthetic options.
I'm just wondering about size, because again, like this typical module, what other kinds of I've actually used, and I don't even know if this falls under your purvey or not, but brick block, which is more of a brick proportioned block, I should say, on a aquatics project. But then I also know that there's stuff that's longer than 16 inches, for instance. So maybe you could talk about that.
Well, definitely, there are some limits to the production equipment because it's rapid. Essentially, it's like a cookie cutter machine where the mix is put in, the block is formed, and then immediately it's self-supporting and is moved down an assembly line. In terms of limits, there are what they call oversized blocks that are typically 12, sometimes 16 inches tall, 32 inches in width. As the industry's matured, the production palette is what they call it, has gotten larger in general. And there's some really interesting oversized veneers that are available. Some of them are in that polished texture I mentioned. And so you can really give more of a monumental look to a building, or more traditional, almost like a federal stone kind of appearance. You can go bigger or you can go smaller, like you mentioned, where you can get more of a brick aesthetic. A lot of the products we promote are excellent alternatives to using clay brick because they're less expensive and give you a great array of colors. We have 12 standard colors, and they're blends, actually.
Yeah, that's what we did exactly. And I think one of the things working in Southern California, because you mentioned it earlier, like this is a self-supporting wall instead of doing a brick veneer, or because I'm not on the East Coast, I'm not I'm not really knowledgeable about how to even build a wall out of brick, but I do know how to build a wall out of block. And so that was kind of the best of both worlds for us, because the school that we were building this aquatic center in has a lot of brick, and we're trying to kind of fit in contextually, but we wanted to use block to do it, and it allowed us to achieve that.
Massively less expensive to use the system that you're talking about, because if you compare the process of building a veneer wall, you've got to build your load-bearing structure, you've got to have an interior finish, wallboard typically, you've got to have insulation, you've got to have moisture protection and an air barrier, and then you've got to have your veneer and, of course, some system to anchor that veneer to the backup wall. With the system you're describing, you basically got a block,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. It's the load bearing, it's the aesthetic surfaces on inside and out,
Yeah.
and when you just think about the labor side of that and how many trades have to touch the wall assembly before it's done, and the coordination of those trades, that's part of the real appeal of working with these types of products.
You mentioned assemblies, and I think one thing that architects do more than maybe anybody on the building supply side, if I'm just generalizing, is we think in assemblies more than we think in products. So we think of walls, we think of ceilings, we think of roofs, like that is the level of object. And so I'm wondering, like, when it comes to assemblies, including their, their design, their labor, interfacing with other products, and all the layers that go into that, how is that going with respect to your piece of that puzzle? Because I know you cover a lot of those different categories potentially, but then I also assume there's probably things we have to look out for.
Well, I'd give you the example of our product, which is a pre-insulated block, which we call high R or high RH.
Hmm.
And as that product line has evolved, we did a round of innovation on it in around 2012, and it's continued. That product is basically competing with an insulated veneer wall, typically. But what it will provide is a single wide concrete block wall, which would have architectural surfaces on the inside and out. The insulation is within the cells of the block. It's fully grouted. And so what all that adds up to is a system where you've got a fire rating of 4 hours on the wall system. It's built by one trade, and we just had the discussion about the comparison of putting layers versus having it all done by one trade.
Mm-hmm.
Your utilities can travel within the cavities of the wall, and you can do basically cutouts for the utility boxes and so forth. So what we like about it is it's just such a simplification of the system, and you end up with something that's pretty fantastic from a resilience standpoint. Fire resistant.
Mm-hmm.
Block is one of the few materials that's recommended by FEMA for construction in flood zones. So you've got the full range there, and of course with the pre-insulated system, you're able to do some great things on energy conservation, and you have an added benefit of passive resilience if your power goes out. You've got a building that's got thermal mass characteristics,
Mm-hmm.
and it's well insulated. And so if you have to scrape by while you're waiting for the power to go back on, you've got a structure that's going to help you quite a bit to be in much more of a comfortable condition than you might if without the thermal mass characteristics.
So when it comes to how other things are interfacing with these products, what are you guys doing behind the scenes to work with them to provide, or are you, complete solutions or shortcuts for the design side to utilize so that they don't have to reinvent those details every time they're designing?
Well, we of course do everything we can to provide updated details for designers. We provide detailing manuals for both the spec brick, which is the product that you were working with, which is the brick aesthetic CMU. With the pre-insulated walls, we have design manuals because there are some different considerations. We've developed structural design manuals for the structural engineers so that they understand how to reinforce the walls, whether they're building in seismic or non-seismic areas. And of course, we've the reason that I, as the last person you'd ever expect to know Revit, ended up knowing Revit is that we needed to have resources to provide designers. We had great AutoCAD details, but we were getting repeated requests for Revit-based 2D details that can be cut and pasted into plan sets. And so we developed all of that. And when we were working on a warehouse design manual, I ended up doing a couple of plan sets of the masonry specific portions of the building in Revit. And that was an eye-opening experience for me.
The pain of Revit.
Yeah, I feel the pain of the architect. I saw when I was in this process, I did a little bit of research, and I saw that there had been some pushback in the architectural community to Revit, just saying, come on, work with us a little better than what you're doing right now. And I totally get that. The thing about it, it's interesting because our world today, if you have a question about how to do a really obscure thing in Revit, you can find a video that someone has done that will tell you.
Right.
But you end up going through that process time and time again
Yep.
to do what you need to do.
I was once asked, I was in a panel discussion, what is my favorite productivity tool? And my answer was YouTube.
Yes.
Because of that thing that you just brought up. And I think most people think of YouTube as this endless path that I could go down and never see daylight again because one video leads to another. But man, if you're looking for how to do something, whether it's change a fuse on your car to do something in Revit, right? It's on YouTube. It is
Or
an incredible
put a door
resource.
in a curtain wall.
Right? Yeah.
Which
Yep.
it's just amazing how complicated that was made to be, but there is a way to do it,
Right.
And you just
Yeah.
have to look up the video and and follow the steps, and for better or worse, you're done.
I wanted to ask you about the structural engineering side of things. Obviously, the material that you guys are working with is structural in nature. And
Yeah.
so what is it, because I'm not an engineer, how is working with structural engineers maybe dispelling the myths? Are there the similar preconceived ideas on the structural engineering side as there are on the architecture side? And what can we put out there that would maybe help bridge the gap between what you're doing and the structural engineering side of things?
I think that in working with both groups quite a bit, I really appreciate both of them. And of course, there's lots of cliches you can bring to bear on this, and about who's more introverted and all the rest of it. Structural engineers, when I talk to them, they're pretty sure that there's going to be an answer to their question. And they just want you to steer them to the manual to tell them how, and then they will evaluate the manual critically. Our manual was written by David Biggs, who actually, he's just an absolutely wonderful resource. He was called in to do forensic work on the 9/11 situation in terms of which buildings could be salvaged after that. So he's just a top-notch resource. But anyway, the structural engineers typically are pretty convinced there's an answer. You just have to steer them to it. Mm-hmm. A lot of times with the architects, it's interesting. They come in with preconceptions that you can't do something. Where a structural engineer would say, well, I know we're going to be able to figure out a way to do it. I just don't know how yet. But a lot of times the architects, for instance, they'll look at our pre-insulated stuff and say, well, you have to have continuous insulation with that. You have to have a solid sheet of insulation to make that work. And you don't have that, so I don't think we can do it. And then you have to explain what the code says. And, that's not the case. You're looking at the assembly as a whole and how it performs instead of just the insulation. But it's interesting. I guess that would be one thing that I would point out in terms of the differences in working with them. And some of the architects I've worked with have just blown me away with their creativity in terms of the things that they want to do on the aesthetic side. And there we're just trying to figure out a way to make it happen for them, to do the things that they have in mind, because it's exciting.
As an architect myself, of course, every project is unique, right? And so maybe that's where that comes from, which is I'm forging a new path with this material, and I think that's not the case, right? The case mostly is, probably 95% of the time, somebody has done this before, and there's got to be the answer out there, or at least a direction, like you're talking about. The engineers just want to be pointed in the right direction. And I think one of the things that we're trying to address at TECT, which falls under this part of the conversation, is that people are the shortest path to finding those answers. And that's why having this kind of embodied experience and having people who have been in both sides of the industry and have that buildup of experience is so important, right? Because if those people do leave the profession, we are notoriously bad at capturing it before they go, right? And so, like you said earlier, they kind of walk out the door with it. But we still think that, architects in general, I think, are happy, I don't know why, going on Google and trying to find the answer there. And I'm sure you know this, overseeing all of these different manufacturers, all their sites are different. They all present it in different way. They're not necessarily thinking of the architect as their primary audience, right? So they don't necessarily put the right information for that audience forward and make it easy to find. As an architect myself, right, it's going from site to site is an entirely new experience every time. I have to learn how to navigate it. I have to learn how to find what I'm looking for. I might have to reach out to a different individual or fill out a form and wait for them to get back to me. And that's a pain in the butt, right? And we want to skip all that. And I think talking to somebody, like you said, when an engineer comes in and they just want the right direction, the shortest answer is to talk to somebody. Maybe you could just speak to that because of knowing what you know about all these different companies that you're basically representing in your association.
Well, on our own website, we made a conscious decision maybe 3 or 4 years ago to really feature our 800 number, so that people can just lift the phone and call us.
And do people use that, or is it shifting more and more to text-based stuff? Because I'm always curious about that, and I kind of sense that that's more of a generational thing, picking up the phone versus doing it online.
Well,
So
I've got daughters who are, well, I won't say their ages because they wouldn't like me to do that, but they're of a generation that basically you have to sometimes poke them to call somebody instead of texting or emailing or looking it up on a website. Mm-hmm. So there is a generational thing there. On the other hand, when people are in a hurry, I think a lot of them just realize that, okay, if I can call this person and get the answer, that's going to get me home a lot faster than fooling around trying to find it someplace. Because the internet is a pretty big place, and there's a lot of junk out there.
Right.
And you don't really have very good ways, if you're in a hurry, of just validating that what you got is good information. I think we like talking to designers because typically it's a fast conversation, and we're excited about what they're working on and excited to be a part of helping them. And typically we can have, make a pretty quick impact and steer them to the right resource, whatever it is, and get them on their way. And I think everybody kind of enjoys the process.
I don't think architects necessarily even, I don't want to say understand, but don't notice the ability to outsource this kind of fact finding. Because even if you do talk to somebody and they don't know what you need right then, they're going to go find it for you, or they're going to put you in touch with the right person, which is very difficult to do in the digital only scenario.
Well, we will even occasionally send them to a competitor, because we're in this for the long haul, and if we do not have a solution, which is rare, let me say, but if we don't, sometimes they're better served by going to that competitor and getting their answer, and hopefully we've kind of provided a foundation for a good relationship going forward.
And I appreciate that, because if a product is not the right fit, it is very valuable to say that up front, right? And get somebody on the right path, because it's saving you time and it's saving them, and it's not going to destroy that relationship in the future when promises are not met.
Integrity is everything in terms of working with professionals. Mm-hmm. And because they're relying on you to give them a good answer, and we're not helping ourselves if we steer them to something that's not going to work. That's a non-starter for everyone.
Well, what are some questions that you always get, like the stuff that you just hear all the time that you would maybe find in a frequently asked questions kind of a page on a website, but for your industry? What are the questions coming from the design side that you just hear over and over again?
I would say that the number one misconception that's out there is something I alluded to earlier, which is this: it may seem obscure, but it comes up all the time. is the idea that you have to have continuous insulation for your wall to be code compliant. That is, I don't know how that got embedded in so many minds, but it certainly has been. And it's just a kind of a product of the code having two forks in the road that you can follow. One is the R value approach, where you're just looking at the insulation, and there it definitely has to be continuous for prescriptive compliance. But the other path is looking at the assembly and using the U factor for the assembly. Now that may sound, I'm listening to these words come out of my mouth and it sounds incredibly obscure, but honestly that is a question that comes up quite often. And when we do our AIA presentations, we even have a slide on it, because typically when we bring it up, a lot of people in the room will say, yeah, that's definitely how I've always saw that issue. I think it's, the other piece of it is just, I think where we need to bridge the gap is that the building products manufacturers probably don't do as great a job of reaching out to architects as they should, to let them know the resources that are available to help them. And maybe the architects don't on their side understand that they can go to a reputable manufacturer and be way ahead of the game, because they'll get the right information. It will save them time, and they'll end up with a better end result.
Yeah, I'm wondering, what are the questions that they should be asking? One of the things that you said earlier is like, there's all these mixes, there's all these shapes. Give us an idea of what's possible, and not specific examples, but like overarching. How many mixes are there? What can be accomplished with block that people aren't thinking of?
Well, I think we start with the cost question. I think architects, because of the way our system works, oftentimes they're blamed for the cost, but they don't really have control over the cost.
Right.
And
cost is not part of the design process. It's not embedded in the design process.
But that owner over there is saying, yeah, talk to me about cost. And I'll tell you how much I like your design. So the cost part of it, I think really the questions that architects should ask, and it's difficult because of the rush of project to project to project, they really should try to get to know the different materials and understand what their strengths and weaknesses are and what the range of aesthetic options are, because it's really just expanding their toolbox in terms of they can get onto something and know that not only does it do what they want to do aesthetically, but it's going to be a good practical solution for their project. Getting to know materials is really, and I don't know to the extent that that's something that's even feasible in today's environment with pressure that people have.
Right.
A lot of manufacturers are more than willing to take you on a tour of their facility, and that doesn't fit at all with the kind of schedule that most people have. But it's the kind of opportunity that if it comes up, folks should take, because they'll come away with a whole different appreciation of what's available. And that would be true for us, and it'd be true for a myriad of materials.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one of the things that architects are fighting against, obviously, is the deadline-driven nature of the work, right? And just finding the time to do the research for something that they may or may not be using on a current project for future knowledge, right? Like, there's a timing issue there. But also, trying to find those resources is difficult because of what I brought up earlier. Every regional block manufacturer has a different website with a different layout and a structure. And are there shortcuts that you guys as an overarching association provide to the design professional side that we could maybe include in the show notes, even for this episode, to link to those as like one place to get to that information?
We put all of our design information up on our website, available for download. The only exceptions are our structural design manual for structural engineers, because we'd like to have some sense of where those are going, and making sure that we can keep them updated. But everything else is up on our website, which is concreteproductsgroup.com. If you go up there, you also see that we've got, I think we're up to 37 different AIA courses that we offer. If you have curiosity about some of the products, For example, one great example is we're just launching a low carbon footprint block that reduces the amount of, it basically increases cement usage efficiency, so you don't need as much cement to make the block, so you've got source reduction. And we've been able to measure the amount of carbon sequestration that the block is doing, so that you get dramatic reductions in the carbon footprint. Block is not a bad perpetrator of carbon footprint because it doesn't use very much cement to begin with. Like, I think only 10% of the weight of most block is cement. But we're able to reduce that significantly. If someone was curious about that, they could go to our website, and we've got a list of our AIA courses, and they can click on that one, and they can see what the upcoming schedule is, so that one would be on the list. I think that one is actually coming up pretty shortly. But we rotate through 37 of these. We do a weekly AIA session over lunch, typically, by webinar, and then we also do a lot of in-firm. We used to be out in the firms until the pandemic, and now it's all webinars.
I can imagine. And everybody has Zoom fatigue, so that doesn't help.
It doesn't help. We try to get to the point and get done, but for folks looking for AIA credit, it's a great way to, short of doing that plant tour, if you want to learn about different aspects of block, I think we've got some pretty good content on these presentations that really covers a lot of the things that people would like to know.
I love the idea of the plant tour, so I want to sign up for that. Because real people, real places. That's why I got into this industry. It's
well, it is the best way to really understand what it's all about. Because a lot of people, I would venture to say that a lot of folks don't really know how a block is made.
Yeah. Right.
They know what a block looks like, but how did it get there? How did that thing turn out in that particular shape? And how did so many of them, all of its friends over there, how did they all get here too? So it's very definitely a good thing to do. Know your materials.
One thing I like about it is that it seems like, and maybe this is just my preconceived idea, it's like you can use this just about anywhere as a building material. Is that true?
Absolutely true. It's if I've been in Mexico City and seen folks making block in their backyard with a single person operated piece of equipment and a shovel. And honestly, that is how our industry got started in the United States. One of our companies still has that old machine that they started with in a driveway in Philadelphia. And if you look around that neighborhood, you'll see that all of the foundations of the homes have this same. The traditional block had a stone molded, kind of a protruding stone texture. Every one of the foundations in that neighborhood has that because they were all made in that driveway.
Wow.
So you're right. It can be made literally anywhere.
I know somebody who has an Adobe house that they built themselves. They made all the Adobe bricks themselves. It's out in Death Valley, actually. And over 5,000 bricks that they built right there on site, hand poured them into the molds and let them dry, cure, and then they built the house out of it. And it's beautiful.
That's a testament to persistence, right?
It sure is. Wow. Yeah, I wouldn't want it. They say that, doing construction is learning what you'll never do again. That's my experience as a homeowner. I can imagine that making Adobe bricks is probably on my list, and I don't even have to do it.
The first 100 would probably be pretty enjoyable.
Yeah. I have one more question for you, and this is kind of something that I want to ask on every episode, and so hopefully you've thought a little bit about this ahead of time, which is, if you're handed a megaphone and you could blast out one message for the building industry to hear, what would you say?
Honestly, I think it goes back to something I said earlier. I think people really just need to understand the materials they're working with and what they're capable of. And we, on our side as material suppliers, need to do a better job of communicating that to the architects. And hopefully the architects can be receptive and do their own research of understanding materials, because that leads to better outcomes. Mm-hmm. I would put block up against most materials in most settings. There may be a few that we're not perfect for. On the other hand, same is true for the things that we compete with. As architects, one of your responsibilities is to pick out the best solution for your client. And I think if we can raise the level of understanding of what materials capabilities are, and better choices are made across the board, everybody's happier right through the chain.
It seems to me like there's a huge opportunity to engage with a block expert or whatever the experts are, because an architect is charged with choosing, right, based on a lot of factors, right? It could
Sure.
be logistics, it could be cost, it could be carbon footprint, it could be so many things. Engaging with the experts early to help make that decision, even if it's not going to be their product, seems like something that should happen a lot more often, because then there's justification there from the experts. I think one of the things that architects feel very strongly about is, I can't know everything about everything, but like you said, you also have to refuse to remain ignorant about these things. So there is a balance that needs to be achieved there. And it seems like early engagement to help make those decisions where all of that burden doesn't just sit upon the architect's shoulders would be welcomed.
We always would be delighted to have somebody. Honestly, if you're in a mode where you're trying to decide on a product, it won't offend me. I would not, I prefer that you pick us, but as long as you're being going through a principled process and selecting criteria, I get it. If there's another material that makes more sense for your project, fine. But I just like to see those decisions being based on real choices.
Yeah, real data, real reasons, real experience, and all of those things. That again, I think the shortcut is talking to people and getting that input, and then filtering it and massaging it to get to that outcome that we're all looking for, which is, it is going to be very specific. And like you said, it's not necessarily going to use your product every time, but to engage you in that process to determine if it's even a possible direction is huge, a hugely underutilized resource early in the design process.
And quite often the material supplier can make the designer aware of things
Right.
that will make their design better.
Don't know what you don't know until,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
Because
great.
how can anyone be expected to know all this stuff?
Right.
There's just tons of details on every. Our materials are simpler than most. There's still a fair amount on ours that needs to be understood. And it's very difficult for designers, and we just want to be a resource and help them navigate this process. And we feel pretty confident that what we have to offer will be a good choice on a lot of the things that they're looking at.
Well, that's what the Peopleverse is all about. And it's about connecting people and telling these awesome stories. This was really fun, Bill. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this today.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Hey, before you go, can you do one thing for me? Hit the like button. It really does help us in the YouTube universe. Watching all the way to the end is probably even more helpful, so thank you for that too. It all adds up and helps more people find the show. These are great ways for you to help spread the word and contribute to the Peopleverse. If you want to help the channel even more, please subscribe and use that red button right down there and turn on the notification bell so that you'll know exactly when the next episode comes out. It's completely free to do so. And finally, do you have something to add to this conversation? If you do, leave a comment. I read all of them. I can't wait to share the next conversation with you. So until then, see you soon.